element. Space is a couple different things in photography. First, space is a photograph's space is the area within the frame. So the picture plane, the rectangle, the viewfinder that you're looking through, that is the space of a photograph. Next, it's the way two-dimensional things are arranged on, the way things are arranged two-dimensionally within that picture plane. And finally, it can also be the illusion of three-dimensional depth in a photograph. So we live in a three-dimensional world, and so if you're taking a photograph of an area that's, sizable or not even necessarily sizable, we're always going to have that sense of three-dimensional space in our photograph. The first way we can talk about space is positive and negative space. This is my favorite. I don't know if having a favorite thing about space is a thing, but it is. I have it. Positive and negative space is my favorite. Positive space is the stuff of an image, the subject, and negative space is everything around it. So on the bottom, this is easiest to see if a photograph is really simple. So like on the bottom left, the chair is our positive space, and then everything else is the negative space, the wall. And I also put the top right picture in there because I wanted to show you that this idea still applies even if it's a more busy photograph. So our subject here is the traffic cop, the positive space is him, and the negative space is everything else. The classic way of understanding space is foreground, middle ground, and background. So as I was saying before, we live in a three-dimensional world, but photographs are flat. So when we flatten that three-dimensional world onto a picture plane, foreground, middle ground, and background is what results. Foreground is what would be closest to us in three-dimensional space, and in a photograph it would be near the bottom. Things in the foreground typically look bigger. Middle ground is, big surprise, the middle in between the fore and the background. And then background would be what is furthest away from you in three-dimensional space. So in the photograph, it would be towards the top of the photograph, and things that are in the background are going to look smaller. PSA, you do not need to put your subject in the foreground of your photograph. Sometimes it can be really interesting to have your subject further back, maybe in the middle ground, like on the bottom right, or even in the background, like on the bottom left. Understanding space. We have talked about depth of field a tiny bit in the beginning of the trimester, basic photography vocabulary. Depth of field is how much of your photograph is sharp and how much is blurry. And this is controlled. This is one of the aspects controlled by one of the aspects of exposure, which we'll learn about next for our next unit. But the use of detail and lack of detail really helps to create and define space. When things are detailed, it feels like they are close to us, whereas things that are blurry feel further away. So in these two sets of pictures, they're the same picture with different depths of field. And like, for example, the cherries on the left, the back cherry feels a lot further away than the back cherry on the right, even though they're the same distance, because it's blurrier, so it feels like it's further away. One-point perspective is also known as leading lines. This is what happens when, especially geometric lines, move into the distance, into a far away space. As things like train tracks, we know that train tracks are parallel. That's why the train can run on them. As they move into the distance, it looks like they come together. We know they don't, because if they did, then the train wouldn't work. But the way that our brain perceives that space, it looks like they come together. So this is called one-point perspective, also diagonal leading lines. It's easiest to see this phenomenon when your photography has a lot of geometric lines. So city streets, buildings, a lot of pictures of, the Bonnie Eagle hallways, we see that very clearly. There are a couple elements that affect our sense of space, color, value, and I forget what the other one is. Well, I guess we'll see. So color, warmer colors, red, yellow, orange, are going to pop forward, as will more saturated colors. So the purer, more vibrant a color is, the more it's going to pop out at us. Whereas cooler, blue, green, purple, and less saturated colors are going to feel like they move backwards. So this photographer, I mean, this is sort of a boring picture to talk about, but this photographer has taken a picture where the yellow flowers are in the background and the blue flowers are in the foreground. This flattens our sense of space. If this photographer walked around to the other side of this garden and photographed it so that the yellow flowers were in front, we'd have a lot deeper of a sense of space because the yellow would be popping forward at us and the blue, which would be in the background, would then be moving away from us. Doesn't matter what language you speak, how old you are going to look at that orangey, whatever that is first, because it's highly saturated and it's warm. Value, this, like 1-point perspective, value really affects our sense of space when we're looking at a large expanse of space. So like if you're hiking or if you're on a long road, darker values are going to feel closer to you and lighter values are going to feel further away. Because when you're photographing a large expanse of space, between you and that far off mountain, there is air, there's atmosphere, there's stuff suspended in the air. So not only does the stuff in the distance get blurrier, but it also gets lighter in value. This is especially true if there's weather, obviously. Things that affect our sense of space: proportion and size. This is not an element, but size is a huge factor in how we understand the space within a photograph. Larger objects are going to feel closer to us, and smaller objects are going to feel further away. So although my brain, when I think about it, knows that this stack of rocks is all sort of equidistant from me, they're all the same distance away, I actually can sort of start to imagine that top rock is actually moving away from me because it's smaller. And we know this lady's hand is twice the size of her head, but because of our perspective, her hand is closer and it looks bigger. And finally, detail. And I talked about this a little bit with depth of field, but the more detail something has, the closer it is, because the closer something is to you, the more detail you can see on it. Whereas when there's less detail, it feels like the thing is moving into the distance. That is space.